The Digital Radio and Audio Review reported last week, and I'm joined now by Ian O'Neill, who chaired the review. Hello, Ian.
Hi there.
So, Ian, what prompted the review and what did it aim to achieve?
Thanks, Yvette. Well, back in 2018, digital radio listening passed the 50% all of radio listening threshold. And the government indicated that it would establish a review at that point to look at progress towards the transition of radio to digital. But obviously, radio is a very dynamic area, and with the growth of IP services, it was apparent that this was going to be a much more complex issue, and no longer a binary matter of an analog switch off and for how long to retain analog services. So the review therefore needed to look at a range of longer term issues facing radio for the period of 10 to 15 years. And particularly to look at the way in which online will affect as those technologies grow and mature. I think that what anchored the review were the forecasts which were developed over 2 years by Mediatek. What this was trying to get to grips with was where the trends for radio and audio listening across different devices, across different platforms, across different listener groups was heading in the next 10 to 15 years. Not with this sort of work and these sorts of projections, it can be no more than a sort of a guiding light. These are definitely not definitive, but that body of work by Mediatek was really helpful to the review in understanding where the future might go and where it was less likely to go in terms of framing future thinking about options. There was a body of research that was done by two companies, Dynata and Ethnic Opinions, looking at ethnic minority audiences. This was something the listening group identified early was an area that, although broadcasters had a lot of information about radio and audio habits amongst those listeners, that over a cross-industry view, it was a really under-researched area. And so the Dynata research, which is a 4,000 person quantitative study, and the Ethnic Opinions research was really to try and get behind and understand the differences in attitudes and consumption patterns amongst ethnic audiences, and to understand, what are the opportunities and how should that influence policy in terms of making radio and audio more relevant to people in those communities. There was also research that we did for the first time, looking a bit more at community radio. Community radio is the smallest but very dynamic sector in UK radio. But because of the fragmentation with 300 odd small community stations, we didn't have a definitive picture about their size, share and reach. So we found some money for some work done by Radar to mine their data to try and identify where does community radio fit. And it shows sort of two things. One, that community radio collectively has the audience of a fairly large national commercial station, which is good. But even more important, I think, is that community radio seems to service ethnic audiences for those ethnic minority community stations. So that's a really interesting insight. But right. All those insights, I think, will influence thinking and policy beyond the review in the future.
And now I know the review is over 100-page document, so you can't summarize it in totality, but what were the main conclusions? What did the review's analysis conclude on the future of the sector and how radio and audio is placed today and how it will change over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I think first and foremost, radio is in a very good place. It's a strong, trusted media. The public really value it, particularly for news. It's performed very, very well all across the different sector, whether the BBC, commercial radio or community radio during COVID-19. And as the review highlights, the sector has been able to adapt with the opportunities of digital technology and the growth and development of DAB. But listener behaviour is changing with the availability of new smart speakers and connected devices, and so it's really, really important that the review looked at those and those trends, and to ensure that radio is able to continue to adapt for that future. So the overall conclusion was that radio is still really, really important, that even in the mid-2030s it will still account for 50% or more of UK audio consumption. That may of course change if technology moves on apace in a different direction, but it may actually be an undercounting if radio continues to attract and retain its audiences. So very much the review sees a hybrid future of analog technologies being eventually overtaken by both DAB and hybrid, with a hybrid world into the mid-2030s and beyond.
Now, there are 42 recommendations in total in the report, and they're all important, but can you just highlight a couple of the really key fundamental ones for us?
Well, I think the two biggest ones are obviously the conclusion that radio needed to retain FM until at least 2030, which essentially is a collective industry view that a radio switchover is not on the cards in the next few years. And I think that's based on an understanding that with all the challenges that radio is facing at the moment, whether it's the impact of COVID or the emergence of new platforms, that it isn't a straightforward issue anymore, and that what radio needs to do most is to retain its listeners and to bring them into digital, whether that's online or via DAB, in a way which works with them, and therefore pushing them into a switch over where collectively the benefits are not so significant to radio broadcasters is I think a sensible call. But I think the other key, so that's obviously the main headline. But the other key recommendation I think is from the work on smart speakers, which is that there are issues ahead in terms of radio and its carriage and security of its carriage across smart speaker voice activated platforms, and that the review concludes that some regulatory change is needed to ensure that radio can continue to reach its audiences and thrive in the future. And so the review has come with a package of recommendations and for government to consider.
Now, just to focus in on DAB and DAB Plus devices, according to research commissioned for the review, sales of single-purpose radio devices are going to continue to slow. So what does the review recommend about radio devices, and specifically DAB and DAB Plus?
Well, in the light of the conclusion about FM and its retention, the review considered whether or not there was a case to mandate DAB and DAB Plus, so a digital mandate in all radios, and there are arguments for that. But in the end, the conclusion was that may give a boost, but it might impact on access to low cost radios. So the conclusion was not to go down that option, but to instead there was broader support for sorting out the issue of DAB radios being sold with no DAB Plus capability. With the explosion of services, particularly on commercial side, and more small scale stations coming up, we think it's probably time to be moving in that direction to have DAB Plus required in all radio receivers. So I think that we've set a timescale for that of 2023. But we would hope that the industry will the bit of the radio industry that still produces DAB only radio sets will migrate all of that to DAB Plus. It's clear that having radios capable of both DAB and DAB Plus standards are really important for consumers.
Now, cars have traditionally been a very important radio listening environment, but we know that drivers are increasingly using their smartphones in their car to listen to audio, and connected cars are bringing more competition to radio in the car. So what were the review's key findings for the automotive sector?
Well, I think just stand back a little bit. I think radio in the car is still really important for drivers, and it will be for the future. And as you said, look, there's more and more choice on all the connected audio services, and they're great, whether connecting via your smartphone or via the various streaming services, some of which are now built into cars. But I think what needs to be recognised is that drivers want choice. They want to be able just to press a button and get radio if they've a need for radio, and that could be triggered by, just wanting to catch up on the news because something is happening in the world that day, even though that they're a streaming listener normally, or because they're in a traffic jam and don't know why or whether they'll get out of it, and so want to get in touch with a local radio station, maybe one they've never heard before, to be able to find out what's going on and what they need to do. So I think radio as functionality for cars remains really, really important. And what we see with the review, and we've said done quite a lot of thinking about it, is that there are, it seems to us that the best way that this would go would be in the hybrid radio solutions, where manufacturers and the radio industry work collectively and engage platforms to make sure that radio remains prominent, but that all this brilliant functionality can be worked in. And there's loads of good examples of how that can be done.
So the publication of the review is a significant milestone, but what are the next steps and actions going forward now?
Okay, well, we've still got a bit of thinking to do about next steps. Obviously, the report is with government. There are some recommendations for government to consider, particularly on the regulation legislation side. And so the government will respond in due course to set out its conclusions there. On the collective recommendations, or the ones where industry broadcasters should get together, we're having a think about whether to continue with some of the structures used very successfully in the reviews, and maybe develop that as some sort of forward action plan to take things forward. But two things I'm very keen on is that part is one, to ensure that there's a really strong focus on diversity and inclusion. Yeah. I mean, the research from Diane Arter and Ethnic Opinions, there's an awful lot to mine there, and there's a lot more understanding that needs to be done. And frankly, I think the industry could do with some help in terms of guiding the way there. So I think that should be an area. The other interesting area, which we haven't really talked about, but which is in the review, is obviously to keep an eye and keep updated the environmental side. The review does provide an assessment of the environmental impact of radio in the UK. And we included that very consciously because of the commitments by the UK government. But we know other governments are thinking about this, about net zero and targets for 2025. So that's another area which and recommendations there that we'd want to keep a track on.
Ian, I think we've only just touched the surface there, but we've covered a lot in those 10 to 15 minutes. We will link to the report on the briefing that this video goes out with, so everyone can read about it in more detail. But thank you so much for talking to us today and giving us that brief overview of a really great piece of work. Thank you so much.
No, not at all. Thanks for that.